Good evening, everyone. I'm meteorologist Dave Snider with you on this 10th of October. Thanks for watching Alaska Weather with us tonight. You can always get your latest forecast information anytime at 1-800-472-0391. That, of course, is the Alaska Weather Information Line. You can find us at weather.gov/Alaska. A simple click on the website will take you to your local forecast information, as well as links to weather observations, satellite and radar pictures, and helpful links to the Alaska Pacific River Forecast Center, the Alaska Aviation Weather Unit, and of course a whole lot of more information if there's an earthquake in the region. The tsunami.gov site is a great place to go. When you can't find what you're looking for, or you'd like more information about what you're seeing, please let me know. I'm happy to help you any way I can. david.snyder@noaa.gov. And a quick shout out, if you are going to AFN, make sure that you come by the NOAA booth and say hi. We'll be downstairs as we were last year. And, well, I should be there for most of the week, so please do stop by and say hi. We'd like to get your pin on the Alaska map. We want to see where everybody's from, and if you're lucky, maybe we'll share one of your pictures there on the show the next week after everyone goes home. So make sure you see us at AFN next week. Here's a look at what's going on across Alaska. A lot of wind moving across south central and southwestern Alaska. The areas that are in yellow here are under wind advisories, and that means gusts could range anywhere from about 30 to 50 miles per hour. That's enough to blow some things around, probably not enough to create a whole lot of damage, but hopefully it's not any worse than that. From the upper Kuskokwim Valley through the Denali region and Healy, the Deltana and Tanana Flats area, as well as the eastern Alaska Range, this entire region is looking at some strong southerly winds, maybe a little more southeasterly through the upper Kuskokwim Valley. But many other places are experiencing some gusty winds this afternoon and this evening. Now for the Anchorage hillside, we've seen gusts today on the order of 30, 40, even 50 miles per hour. A few gusts have been in the 60-mile-an-hour range, and a couple have been a little bit stronger than that. We're not always sure if those are very accurate reports, so I hesitate to mention all of them. But there have been some strong gusts on the hillside, as is pretty normal in this type of weather situation. As we look northward, we also see the upper Koyukuk Valley is under a wind advisory. This is going to be for more of a northeasterly flow that's probably reaching into the 40 and 50 mile an hour range. Low pressure is working up the western side of the Alaska Range with several other pieces rotating around it, but the overall push is from the south across most of the Alaska Range region, and then more of a northeasterly flow for the upper Koyukuk there. All of the wind should improve as we go through the late night hours and into early tomorrow morning. It won't all be gone, but right now it looks like the worst of it will be settling down as we go through the day. Don't be surprised if a few other wind advisories pop up early tomorrow morning where you are between the Alaska Range and some parts of the interior. Here's a look at the satellite picture. A much better look at what we had from yesterday, isn't it? Low pressure is working its way up across southwestern Alaska, and you can see that very strong southerly flow working up the eastern side of a frontal boundary, the separation between one air mass and the other. As this is moving northward, it is pulling in an awful lot of wind across south central Alaska, over Prince William Sound and the Chugach Range and the Talkeetnas, and then pushing that air over the Alaska Range as well. On the back side of this, we're getting a strong north and westerly flow. As that continues to flow into the region, we'll continue to see a pretty blustery day across south and western Alaska, and of course that is feeding in moisture into southwest and places like Norton Sound and the Seward Peninsula. That will continue to see rain and unsettled weather through the remainder of the week. One note here is that southerly flow working across the eastern Gulf is pushing wet weather into southeast Alaska. Your weather's finally changed for the wetter. And as we look across central and southern parts of the Panhandle, it should be no surprise to see rainfall reports coming out of Sitka and Ketchikan and many other places in southeast as we go through the next 24 hours or so. High elevation snow will be possible. Most of the peaks will probably get a little bit wider as we go through the next couple of days there, but for right now, southeast isn't looking at any snowfall anytime soon. But we are expecting to see cold enough air across the Brooks Range, and maybe in some lower terrain locations, you might see rain mixing in with some snowflakes. One thing that's going to really work against that, though, especially in the middle Tanana Valley and for our friends around Fairbanks to North Pole and along the highway there, a lot of wind coming off of the Alaska range usually precludes any major precipitation. So you may see gray clouds, you might even get a drip or a flake, but a lot of that Chinook wind coming off of the range will probably keep things drier than wetter. Here's a look at the weather map now, a complicated picture, but you should focus on this 983 millibar low here. And looking at this with you, I can see where it's a little hard to pick out the state of Alaska, so let me draw it in with my finger. Here's the North Slope. Here is Norton Sound, Kotzebue Sound, and Norton Sound's here, the southwest and the YK Delta, Bristol Bay, all the way out across the Alaska Peninsula and the northern Gulf Coast. Moving in across the region there is rain and warm front. As this is wrapping its way northward, we're getting a lot of wind over the range, and then that north and northeasterly flow coming through the upper Koyukuk Valley around Bettles is where we would expect to see a little bit more of that gusty wind developing on the north side of the system. All of this is moving northward. We have a more of a north to south blowing wind across the Bering Sea, and things are going to remain fairly unsettled there for the next several days. As low pressure reorganizes as we get into tonight and tomorrow, the main center of attention is going to be out here across the west coast. This will be our new low at 984 millibars, and what you're going to notice is the overall weather pattern is going to rotate around this central point as we go through the rest of the weekend into the weekend. As that happens, pieces of storm energy are going to rotate around this and kind of spin off, just as if you took a record player, and most of you probably know what that is. Put a record player down, put a marble on that record, which you wouldn't want to do with your best collection, and watch that spin off. That's exactly what's happening to each one of these puzzles here. There's little marbles stuck around the main pivot point of that record, and they're just spinning off. And some of those are spinning off into southeastern Alaska, bringing in some of that very beneficial rainfall. Thankfully, not a whole lot of the wind. One thing that is happening too is we're pulling in colder air from some of the more Arctic regimes up across Alaska and Canada, and we're starting to see that wintry changeover in some of the higher terrains. Snow showers may be more likely across some parts of the central and northern interior, but again, not expecting any major snowfall across Fairbanks. But as you're driving up and over the Richardson, you might start to see a little bit more white on your journey there. Now, out to the west, that strong and persistent southwest flow will probably bring in a lot of rain and low ceilings and decks for many aviators out across Southwest, not to mention the chop and turbulence that's going to be fairly persistent across the Alaska Peninsula from Cold Bay to False Pass, all the way up through Shelikof Strait and Kodiak Island just tonight alone. As we get into the next couple days, you can see that persistent southerly flow remaining tight. Look at the pressure pattern here. Those lines of constant pressure are called isobars, and as I always say, the tighter they get, the faster the wind's flowing across most of western Alaska, and that's where we're focusing on today. High pressure sitting across the Gulf of Alaska tomorrow afternoon. You can see it's already pushing out that wave of rain through south parts of southeast, which is good, and that's keeping rainfall there. But eventually it's going to move it on into the Pacific Northwest, and things are going to dry up once again as we head toward Friday. Showers of snow continue across the Brooks Range, most of that again at higher terrain and across the Chukchi Coast. Don't be surprised to run into pockets of either snow or maybe even some freezing rain. Across the coast today, we saw temperatures dropping well below freezing, and it looks like there's still liquid cloud cover floating around there, so the air above isn't terribly cold. So you could run into some icing there even below 3,000 feet. You'll see that in the aviation segment coming up here in just a minute. Low pressure hovers across the west coast at 984 millibars, and things will be fairly choppy across the Bering for the next few days as well. Here's Friday. The low pressure system is filling in. That means that number is going to come up, and it does, to 994 millibars. A strong southerly flow continues across the northern Gulf Coast. You'll see that focus bringing in rain and clouds to many from Prince William Sound to the Kenai Peninsula and the Matanuska and Susitna Valleys. A broad southwesterly flow continues across the west coast. Areas of light snow may be mixed with rain across the north slope. High pressure digs into southeastern Alaska, breaking up the clouds again as we wrap up the week. And a hint of the next weather maker is already showing up on the other side of the screen there at 982 millibars. Another wave of low pressure moves into the Bering to wrap up the week. Let's take a look at temperatures for tonight. It is going to be cold up across the north slope from Utqiagvik all the way out toward Kaktovik. Temps in the upper 20s into Fort Yukon, 24, one of the colder spots there, as well as Eagle and Northway at 21. The middle Tanana Valley pushing that freezing mark, getting pretty close there. Temps in south central in the lower 40s. Southwest also pushing that 40-degree mark. Norton Sound, the Seward Peninsula back in the mid to upper 30s. Galena only 34. 30s and 40s for many in southeast. The Alaska Peninsula and the Chain also hovering in the 40s. 43 in Kodiak. Looking at Thursday, you'll see temps in the 30s across the north, 40s and 50s for southwest. Bristol Bay, mid-50s, 52 in Kodiak. Low 50s for southeast. South central, close to 50 degrees. A look at tonight and tomorrow's online anytime.
And now, aviation weather around Alaska.
Moving on to aviation weather now, IFR conditions will spread from northwestern parts of the Yukon-Kuskokwim Delta, Norton Sound, and the southern Seward Peninsula all the way out to St. Lawrence Island and eastward along the Yukon Valley and into the south-facing slopes of the eastern Brooks Range, as well as the north slope as we get your Thursday morning started. For the Chugach Range, the Talkeetnas, into the Wrangell-St. Elias region, and the higher elevations of southeast and the Dixon Entrance, expect to start around IFR. Of course, most of the Bering Sea, as well as a large part of the remaining southwestern coast and interior, will be covered up with MVFR conditions, and watch for some icing potential at lower altitudes there across the north slope, especially along the Chukchi coast in the morning. As we get into the afternoon Thursday, IFR is likely from Utqiagvik and Wainwright eastward toward just north of Kaktovik, north of the Yukon Valley, but on the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range and even over some of your favorite passes, and of course across some of the hit-and-miss peaks there around the Alaska Range, the Chugach, and then points eastward. We see some improvement across southeast with VFR conditions developing on the inside passages, but MVFR across some of the higher terrain. Widespread MVFR is expected across the west coast, most of the Bering Sea and the Chain. No change as we get into Friday. Watch for IFR conditions there from Nome westward toward Wales and Tin City, just about to St. Lawrence Island and north of Vimanik out toward Unalakleet and inland as we head out toward Galena. IFR conditions will be just along the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range and also across some parts of the north slope to Atkasuk and points east, with MVFR fairly widespread across south central and the Kenai Peninsula and Cook Inlet. Southeast gets a break in the morning. By the afternoon, conditions start to set in with MVFR around the northern passes for southeast. The rest of the region stays fairly clear. And we'll watch for an area of convection to develop across the interior, generally north of the Alaska Range and south of the Yukon River there around the middle Tanana Valley. Just to the north, IFR conditions are expected across the south-facing slopes of the Brooks Range once again, across the Bering Strait, and most of the Bering Sea as well as the west coast should be under MVFR conditions for your Friday. Here's your pass conditions now as we see it for Anaktuvik and Adigan Pass. We expect to see IFR conditions pretty much all day long as we're blowing in an awful lot of moisture right up over the Brooks Range. Lake Clark and Merrill Pass expected to hold at IFR most of the day. Rainy Pass looking at an MVFR end of the day, but an IFR start for sure it looks like. Windy Pass expecting to see IFR conditions really most of the day. Really no change as we go around eastward toward Isabel. IFR conditions for all of your Thursday there. Mentasta Pass may start at VFR, but as moisture is moving eastward, the ceilings and visibility may come down a little bit in the afternoon, and at least in the vicinity, if not right there for the pass. So keep your eye on that. Maybe a transition to marginal. Tanita Pass looks like it'll hold around IFR most of your Thursday there. Portage Pass marginal. Again, this will mainly be affecting the eastern side with some improvements slowly developing on the west. And Chilkoot and White Pass a little different for your Thursday. MVFR and Chilkoot with improvements toward VFR. White Pass may not be quite as lucky. IFR conditions there to start the morning, and then maybe a transition over to MVFR as the day goes on. Freezing levels show that tight gradient there. A lot of warm air still lodged in place across southeastern Alaska. For the mainland, 2,000 to 4,000 foot levels pretty much rule the roost across the region, with the surface freezing line cutting into the Chukchi coast and then dropping down to around Fairbanks and just north there as we go through your Thursday. Icing potential is fairly widespread. Take a look at the levels though up across the north slope, especially for the Chukchi coast. There's a decent opportunity that we'll see some icing below 3,000 feet as there's some cold air trapped into the region. And then as you move out across the eastern parts of the mainland, levels climb from 6 to about 10,000 feet and above. Out to the west though, the levels are dropping behind this a large area of low pressure there, so at least 4,000 feet, maybe a little bit lower in some cases, to about 6,000 feet towards south central and the west coast. The jet stream has our low pressure system around St. Lawrence Island. The north side of that has a 50-knot jet wrapping around, but the main quarter of fast-moving air is still digging across the North Pacific and sending fast-moving waves across the Gulf of Alaska at around 110 knots. The coldest air still locked well to the north, though some cold is sneaking in. Southerlies are strong across south central, southwest, and Kodiak Island. Wind speeds there 40 to 60 knots. A west and southwesterly flow coming in to southeastern Alaska. Easterlies for the north slope. As we look at 3,000 feet, the stronger southerly flow there, anywhere from 50 to 70 knots coming in for south central. The ridge still holding across the eastern Gulf, and wind speeds in the central and northwestern interior from 50 to 30 knots, and northerlies across the Aleutians up to 40 knots. And turbulence, of course, expected to be at least considerable moderate, with isolated severe still possible below 8 to 10,000 feet, mainly across south central. A bump or two across southeastern Alaska is expected tomorrow too.
Just as the sun is part of weather on Earth, it also affects weather in space. The sun creates solar wind by steadily releasing a flow of plasma particles in all directions around it. Sometimes the sun gives off a flash of light and X-rays. This is known as a solar flare. When massive bursts of particles explode into space, we call it a coronal mass ejection, or CME. When a CME is directed toward Earth, it hits the magnetosphere, the magnetic field around our planet that protects us. If the storm is large, we may even get to enjoy a light display in the sky called the auroras. In space, satellites may be damaged, and astronauts should take cover. On Earth, people do not feel any physical effects. We may lose electricity in some areas, polar flights may be rerouted, and satellite services may be disrupted. While these situations aren't ideal, they are rare and fixable. This is why we will continue to study the sun and its interactions with Earth and the solar system.
Longing for more space, open skies, and exotic travel? Then look up, about 30 to 600 miles straight up, at the ionosphere, Earth's interface to space. Nestled far above the clouds but below outer space, this little understood destination invites you to explore its many features. Experience both the weather from Earth and the weather from space. Marvel at the ballet of radio waves and navigation signals, like GPS, leaping through this particle paradise. Sit back, relax, and take in the aurora, some satellites, and the International Space Station as they sail by. And you'll want your camera handy for one of the region's signature features, bright and colorful air glow. This daily show is made possible by the ionosphere's own swirling charged particles, because that's what the ionosphere is. It's all charged particles. During the day, enjoy the sea of particles, freshly energized by the sun. As the sun sets, this particle party relaxes and the air glow thins. Our quieter nightlife lets you gaze into clearer skies. The ionosphere is in constant motion, an amazing effect of space weather. Don't miss when solar storms rain down. The storm separates the particles even more, making this colorful region delightfully more dense in some places and stunningly sparse in others. And don't forget about storms from Earth below. Your weather from back home also stirs up this one-of-a-kind destination. Experience the unique beauty of every season, as changes in Earth's atmosphere, daily and annually, can create pressure waves, changing the ionosphere's shape and density. Venture to the equator, where our particles are packed in lush and thick. Cruise along a magnetic field line and see how the ionosphere's charged material also interacts with Earth's own magnetic field. Don't miss the superhighway of particles zipping out to space and back down to the planet. This unpredictable parade of charged particles can help you unplug and unwind. This is because the crowd of particles can garble the radio and satellite communications from home. The ionosphere welcomes you to discover more about this little-known region. After all, once you've explored this interface to space, who knows how much farther you'll be able to go.
When a star, bigger and more massive than the Sun, runs out of fuel at the end of its life, its core collapses while the outer layers are blown off in a supernova explosion. What's left behind depends on the star's original mass. A star roughly 10 to 20 times our Sun leaves behind a neutron star. A more massive star becomes a black hole. Unlike black holes, neutron stars are directly observable, usually as pulsars, the lighthouses of the cosmos. Discovered 50 years ago, they are the densest observable objects in the universe. Neutron stars compress up to twice the Sun's mass into a city-sized sphere. Matter is packed so tightly that a teaspoon of neutron star interior would weigh more than 1 billion tons on Earth. Still, the nature of the ultra-dense matter in the cores of neutron stars is unknown. Because neutron stars pack so much mass into such a tiny volume, they produce gravity strong enough to bend the light they emit, distorting their appearance in a way that enables the mass and size of the star to be measured. Scientists cannot reproduce the extreme conditions in and around neutron stars on Earth. They must look into the galaxy to answer decades-old questions about extreme matter and gravity. NASA's Neutron Star Interior Composition Explorer mission, or NISA, will make X-ray observations of neutron stars from its perch on the International Space Station. It will give astronomers more insight into these mysterious objects, helping determine what is under their surface. A multi-purpose mission, NISA includes a technology demonstration called Sextant. It will analyze NISA's observations to validate the use of rapidly rotating neutron stars as navigation beacons for travel in deep space throughout the solar system and beyond.
And now, marine weather around Alaska.
On to marine weather now, and a look at today's sea ice edge shows some newer ice growing well north of the Arctic coast and the Beaufort Sea coast, north of Dead Horse and Prudhoe Bay, out toward Kaktovik, and all the way along the Beaufort Sea coast. We've seen new ice develop in recent days, some of that making concentrations above 80%, and just north of that, slightly lesser concentrations that stretch all the way around to Point Barrow. You can also see some newer ice forming out across the pack along demarcation point and points northward there. The trick, of course, though, is how thick is this ice? And a lot of it is fairly new ice, just formed in the last couple days, so not very thick at all, but it is forming. As the weather turns colder as we head toward the weekend, we would expect new ice to form up across some of the open water regions there. For the very latest look anytime, head to weather.gov/Anchorage/ice. As we look at southeast, sustained winds will come out of the south at a light pace, about 10 knots or so, 2-foot seas as you head through Stevens Passage and the northern Lynn Canal. Onshore flow extends all the way from Prince William Sound to about, well, as you get just south of Sitka and Port Alexander, 15 to 20 knots expected with 9 to 10-foot seas. More of a northwesterly flow around the Dixon entrance, and then a stronger southeasterly flow through the Clarence Strait as low pressure and a trough is working through the region here. We expect higher winds and seas as a result. As we get into Friday, winds settle down a little bit. You're looking at about 5 to 10 knots from Stevens Passage up toward the Lynn Canal. Looking for 2-foot seas there and also through Clarence Strait, but with more of a northwesterly flow. That onshore flow continues all the way from Cross Sound down to the Dixon entrance, about 15 knots there with 8-foot seas. And southerlies from Yakutat points westward toward Prince William Sound, about 8 to 9-foot seas there for Friday. In Prince William Sound tomorrow, 15 knots and 5-foot seas, southwesterlies on the outside of Hitchinbrook entrance. South and westerly winds from the Barren Islands into the Resurrection Bay region, 9 to 10-foot seas expected there. And for Cook Inlet, southerlies 20 knots, and most areas looking at about 6-foot seas or so as you go through your Thursday afternoon. Winds are going to come up again as we get another surge of southerlies working into the western Gulf, 20 to 30 knots across the northern Gulf waters. Anywhere from 11 to 13-foot seas. Southeasterlies coming up in Prince William Sound Friday, 5-foot seas there. Southeasterlies from the western Barrens all the way up to Clam Gulch, about 30 to 35, 7 to 9-foot seas, and 5-foot seas expected across the northern Cook Inlet waters there, 15 knots out of the southeast for your Friday. For southwest in Bristol Bay, look for 30 knots and 7-foot seas, 9-foot seas down the coast. Southerly winds all the way up toward Kodiak Island for your Thursday. Not as strong as today, but winds will still be up there. 25 to 35 knots in most areas with 12 to 15, even 16-foot seas down toward Sand Point. As you get into Friday, that higher swell of seas extends a little bit further eastward, 14 to 16-foot seas closer to the coast and Kodiak Island. 20 knots sustained inside of Shelikof Strait. That'll get you 6-foot seas, and 6-foot seas down the Alaska Peninsula coastline. Southerlies inside of Bristol Bay, 20 knots there with a 6-foot sea for your Friday. For the west, north and westerly wind for Kiska and Attu, 14-foot seas there on the 30-knot wind for Thursday. For the central and eastern chain, 15 to as strong as 35 knots across the Pacific coastline, 11 to 16-foot seas with that west and southwesterly wind. As we get into Friday, expect a very similar wind pattern there. You can see the overall flow rotating around low pressure across the central and northern Bering Sea. 20 to 25 in most areas, with the exception of Nikolsky to Unalaska at 15, and otherwise about 8 to 10-foot seas there. In the west, similar conditions, a west and southwesterly flow. Remember, low pressure strengthening just to the west of the western Aleutians as we go into the weekend. As we look at the Bering Sea, 25-knot winds will be fairly common across the region. Westerlies about 15 with 7-foot seas for the Pribilofs. Southerlies inside of Norton Sound, 20 knots with a 4-foot sea blowing right into Nome. And south and westerlies will continue for many locations across the Kuskokwim Delta, 25 knots there with 8 to 9-foot seas. For Friday, conditions improve a little bit just north of Macquarie and Nunivak Island. Otherwise, things are pretty much the same. An east and southeasterly flow for Norton Sound and St. Lawrence Island. Northerlies coming into St. Matthew, and the Pribilofs, a little bit more of a westerly flow there, 20 knots with an 8-foot sea. Southerlies south of Nunivak Island and over the Kuskokwim Delta region at 25 knots with 6-foot seas. For the North Slope, broad easterly flow turns into northeasterly winds for the Chukchi coast, 25 to 30 there, 10 to 13-foot seas across the northwest coast for Thursday. For Friday, look for seas and winds to settle down, still looking at 6 to 8-foot seas for the Chukchi and 15 to 20 for the Beaufort Seacoast with 4 to 6-foot seas on Friday. Recapping tonight's weather, a lot of wind across south central, the Alaska Range, the upper Koyukuk, and the upper Kuskokwim with wind advisories for many of those locations. Snow on the higher train up north, but rain and wind continue in the south and for southeast as we go through Friday.
These forecasts are for planning purposes only. Call 1-800-WX-BRIEF for a formal pre-flight briefing. Always file a flight plan before you go flying. The U.S. Coast Guard Auxiliary urges you to leave a float plan with a friend or the harbor master before you go boating.